Well, welcome to the Existentialist Society in Melbourne, Australia. I'm David Miller, Secretary of the Existentialist Society. Our speaker today is Lafayette, and his topic is the decline of French philosophy. Over to you, Lev.
All right. I would start off by I'm actually giving my presentation in the back of the stage of the Coburg Town Hall. So a good place to start. There's another event occurring here, but I've managed to sneak away for a couple of hours to do this presentation, which um, David arranged many months ago. And I would like to thank David Miller for again inviting me to speak at the Existentialist Society, as he has done several times in the past as well. I have very fond memories of my first presentation to the society on the phenomenology of technology in 1995. I was at the Royal Society Lecture Theatre, and that's more than 3 decades in the past, and has some relevance with today's presentation. I may also mention that 132 years ago on this day, anarchists carried out a bombing at the Lafayette restaurant in Rue Condé, Paris, part of the series of propaganda by the deed by anarchists against class enemies at the time, and the restaurant itself was popular amongst politicians and their paymasters. In this case, the bomb, placed inside a flower vase, only managed to permanently injure one person, Laurent Talade, a fellow anarchist sympathizer, poet, and good friend of the famous art critic, curator, and collector and anarchist, Félix Fénénon, who was deemed responsible for the bomb. The bomb did, however, leave a rather sizable hole of more than a metre in diameter in the restaurant wall. So, as part of an ongoing campaign of fratricidal actions by anarchists against anarchists, whether by intent or accident, I hope we can avoid that today. Instead, I rather like to think of the Existentialist Society, along with several other groups located in Melbourne, to be more akin to the French Republic of Letters, or perhaps even more appropriately, a version of the salons hosted by Marie Geoffron, Julie de Lepinat, and Suzanne Necker, among others. I especially want to emphasize that the salons were more than mere leisure gatherings for educated members of society and fine artists. They were a weapon of the Enlightenment, civil and critical working spaces for which one would call the public sphere, and would directly lead to the French Revolution. This description is important in understanding today's presentation, the decline of French philosophy, as the Salon and the Republic of Letters are the beginning of critical French philosophy, whose output and insight provided a leading trajectory for over 2 centuries from the mid-1750s onwards. It is necessary to begin with some working definitions that are elaborated from the presentation's title, Decline, French Philosophy. By decline, we understand something that has become fewer or lessened. But I also want to incorporate this in a narrative and a historical sense. Modern French philosophy has an origin, it has a development, it has an apogee. It is now experiencing a decline that has lasted for some decades, but with the possibility of either the gradual fading away with a whimper or with a steadfast revival. The definition of French is no simple matter either. It does not seem appropriate, does not seem quite right to limit that description to those ideas and writings whose origins are within the borders of France only. Apart from the overseas territories, there are contributions from intellectuals from French colonies and other countries under French control, as France to this day is ruled with imperialist intent. Further, there are, of course, French-speaking regions of Europe and Canada as part of other countries, notably Belgium, Switzerland, and Canada. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be more inclusive rather than exclusive, and define French philosophy as those works and ideas expressed in the French language, carrying l'esprit de français. For what it's worth, a transcript of this presentation will be appropriately provided in English and in French. Finally, there is the matter of philosophy. Now, I take up a role as the university outreach officer for the International Society of Philosophers, and I'm an incorrigible collector of stiff pieces of cardboard. So it's perhaps unsurprising that I have a fairly formal personal definition of what constitutes philosophy. That is ontology, epistemology, and logic. These three subjects are really the origin of all other knowledge, and notably a great deal of what is called philosophy, and especially existentialist philosophy, is perhaps more properly allocated under the relatively new discipline of positive psychology, the study of what makes life worth living. I will, for the purposes of this presentation, and in particularly for this society, include positive psychology. If you like, in a contemporary sense, the presentation could be entitled The Decline of French Philosophy and Psychology. And certainly some French psychology will be a particular point of concern. Disciplines change, of course, but as the famous Wikipedia game illustrates, everything leads to philosophy. With these definitions in place, it is appropriate to engage in a somewhat whirlwind tour of the important contributions of French philosophy. Your presenter is a self-confessed Francophile, albeit a critical one. There can be no doubt of my long-standing Francophile tendencies when it comes to the fine arts, cuisine, Republican politics, French philosophy, at least from the Enlightenment to the Situationists. I admire the gentle spirit of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the grand knowledge and scope of Denis Diderot, and the courage of that entire body of Les Philosophes, who took on the absolutism of the monarchy, the dead hand of the church, and helped establish the modern public sphere through the aforementioned salon gatherings that scandalously hosted by women patrons, les Solinaires. In the 19th century, moving on to the 19th century, positive philosophy would find leadership with Henri de Saint-Simon, Auguste Comte, his friend, collaborator, until they had a bit of an argument and so went their separate ways. Hippolyte Taine as respective contributions to the idealized visions of society through technology and with technology, the application of the scientific method to sociology, and remarkably, in the latter case, a positive contribution to the arts. It is important here to also recognize the enormous contributions to the history and philosophy of science by physicist Pierre Duhem, who was very influential on 20th century positivism. And by way of contrast, one must mention the systemic eclecticism of Victor Cousin. Crossing the 2 centuries, one witnesses Henri Bergson's contribution to psychology, the unconscious, memory, and multiplicity. In the 20th century, there's the mathematics and physics of Henri Poincaré, the perceptual phenomenology of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, which would add to the hermeneutics of Paul Ricoeur, all of which would contribute to that fascinating and unique French epistemology in the philosophy of science. There is also the incredible contributions to feminism by Simone de Beauvoir and her companion Jean-Paul Sartre, both along with Albert Camus' ontological absurdism and the incredible and inspiring personal standards of Simone Weil raised and established existentialism as the most powerful force in the world of philosophy at the time, demanding the primacy of existence over essence, authenticity in behavior and thought, and recognition of the tension between people as objects and subjects. Then there is the field of semiotics, or to use the French term, semiology, the study of signs, symbols, interpretation, and meaning, whose origins are from Ferdinand de Saussure. From semiology, there's also the development of structuralism, a semiological method for character interpretation, narrative analysis, especially with the role of synchronic and diachronic meanings, used in cognition, behavior, and culture. It will be employed by Claude Lévi-Strauss in anthropology, Roland Barthes in semiology, Louis Althusser in structuralist Marxism, Pierre Bourdieu in sociology, Jean Piaget in developmental psychology, and Jacques Lacan in psychoanalysis, and much more on the later soon. The mid-20th century, the 1950s, 1960s, representing an apogee of modern French philosophy. In the wake of the Second World War, the existential question of authenticity had particular resonance. When times are dark and hard, the inner lights of bravery and moral character shine strongest. It is easy to tend towards authenticity when one's life is relaxed and comfortable. It's another matter entirely when your country is under military occupation by Nazis. As Europe rebuilt, France was able to acquire prestige on the Security Council of the United Nations, whilst at the same time, the people in French West Africa, Indochina, and elsewhere were overthrowing the yoke of colonialism and imperialism. And this action was largely supported by French philosophers at the time, especially and notably those associated with the existentialist school. French nationalists of different stripes, reactionaries, conservatives, liberals, were less supportive to different degrees. As expected, the conservatives and those beyond to the right of politics were often outright violent towards the independence movements, and in some cases still are. For liberal nationalists, the reaction could generate some wry humor. But you are part of the greatest civilization in history, they would say to their non-European subjects. Why don't you want to be French? A conflict between the old France and the new post-war period reached a crisis point in the famous events of May 1968, where a combination of massive workplace strikes and occupations were mixed with widespread student protests. In this case, unlike the French Revolution, the establishment forces were successful in retaining power, at least in part by the failure of the French Communist Party to adopt a revolutionary posture. They did achieve a 10% increase in salaries and a 35% increase in the minimum wage. And in doing so, the price of their compliance was established. It barely covered the lost wages during the strike period. The events, and especially the failures of May 1968, had a devastating effect on the French intellectuals. Structuralism devolved under Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida into post-structuralism and deconstructionism, respectively. Foucault's historical analysis of power, institutions, and behaviors are notable and laudable, but philosophically, the inquiries were marred by methodological vagueness and ethical relativism, and sociologically, agency is neglected, leaving a one-sided view of power and ultimately becoming unable to differentiate between truth, power, and knowledge. From Derrida, we find a useful method to apply dialectics, especially to literary analysis. Derrida would engage in intentional obfuscation by using words of ambivalent meaning. This playfulness, jouissance, would be a feature of post-structuralist and postmodernist thought. And there is a great deal of insightful, poetic, and even therapeutic value to such behavior. However, at some point, it is necessary to speak in a clear and honest manner. As ordinary language philosopher John Searle accurately said in his famous debate with Derrida, the low level of philosophical argumentation, the deliberate obscurationism of the prose, the wildly exaggerated claims, and the constant striving to give the appearance of profundity while making claims that seem paradoxical, but under analysis would often turn out to be silly or trivial. Rather than addressing, end of quote, rather than addressing the critical issues of modern society, such as what was the recently deceased Jürgen Habermas achieved in Germany with legitimation crisis, the French intellectuals enthusiastically moved towards ambiguity and often dubious scholarship employed in writings such as Jean-Francois Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, which made some especially fascinating claims about quantum mechanics and chaos theory. This text does, that is the postmodern condition, does include a promising and nascent sociology of the computerization of society, which unfortunately was not followed through in terms of political economy, as Lyotard retreated from the libidinal to the sublime, a rather sad state for a person who had dedicated 15 years of their life to revolutionary politics in the 1950s and 1960s. Filling this gap, Jean Baudrillard engaged in provocative and idiosyncratic cultural criticism of new media and the interrelationship of science, even trying to build a political economy of semiology, and of course, studies in hyperreality. But he would engage in a sort of grandiose and obscurationist claims, such as statements as the Gulf War, or famous essay, the Gulf War did not take place, and more improbably, that postmodernism represented the end of labor production and of political economy. The same criticism that Searle made towards Derrida can also be applied here. Baudrillard is often more of a celebrity than a scholar. And perhaps the most fashionable influence on many questionable French post-structuralist and postmodernist thought is Jacques Lacan, the single most important thinker that has got a causal relationship to the decline of French philosophical thought. A domineering, intelligent, manipulative, and charismatic figure, celebrity Lacan was expelled from the International Psychoanalytic Association, nominally for deviating from fixed-length sessions, which at one point would even be reduced to 10 minutes without a pro-rata reduction in his exorbitant fees, as he stood at the door and cast pearls of wisdom. He was known to physically assault his patients and, if they were to his liking, seduce them, and had a suicide rate amongst patients that was abnormally high. He would call himself master to his students, and as an example of great irony, broke a long-standing friendship with a collaborator who wrote an article on narcissism, but failed to quote him. A deliberately obscurationist writer, Lacan would shift his meaning of words that he used, at the same time arguing that he was engaging in a form of structuralism, claiming that the psychoanalytic experience discovers in the unconscious the whole structure of language, whilst also arguing that he represented a return to Freud, apparently unlike other psychoanalysts. Lacan conflated and confused the unconscious with the preconscious, and almost entirely derived his linguistic knowledge from Saussure, even when the rest of the world in linguistics had moved on to others, such as Chomsky. Notably, Chomsky considered Lacan to be a charlatan. Lacan, impressed with mathematics, but with evidently little knowledge on the subject, developed math memes with striking inconsistencies in symbolic representation as simple equations or topological descriptions that made little sense, whether from a mathematical or psychoanalytical point of view. The most notorious examples being signifier divided by signified equals statement and The torus really exists and is exactly the structure of the neurotic. It is not an analogy, not even an abstraction, because an abstraction is a sort of diminution of reality. I think the torus is reality itself. Also, the comparison between a square root of -1 and a rational number to a symbolic phallus as an unthinkable concept. As much as Althusser should have kept his hands to himself, Lacan would have done better to keep his hand off it. Lacan had a particular influence on Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, whose two-volume Capitalism and Schizophrenia argued that schizophrenia, rather than a mental illness, was instead a process of deteriorization, which allowed liberation from capitalist and Oedipal mental structures. Concentrating on the first volume here, sometimes they would literally refer to the illness, sometimes as a metaphor, and often as a willful, irrational, or transgressive metaphorical mode of thought. In the literal sense, they saw this process as illustrative of experiencing raw, unfiltered intensities, and Guattari would, in particular, develop schizoanalysis to analyze desire and subjectivity. Written in 1972 and 1980, the latter volume, a fascinating example of verbiage applied to cultural studies. These claims are just outright wrong. We know more about schizophrenia now than we did 50 years ago. We know that it is often a debilitating mental illness, one that has a very high genetic influence, and one that is quite treatable with medication. The illness does not provide a raw and unfiltered view of reality, but on the contrary, is characterized by a neurological filtering that generates hallucinations, which often produce terror in the recipient. It is understandably extremely rare for an actual schizophrenic to see their illness as emancipatory in the long run. The opportunity is taken here also to take issue with Deleuze's other major contribution to philosophy, his approach to identity, politics, and difference. This started very well with Deleuze noting that identity is often given priority over difference. Deleuze makes the useful contribution that identity depends on difference, but being too clever by half, concludes by inverting this approach and gives primary to difference over identity. This sort of approach, where a binary opposite is appropriately criticized and replaced with something equally wrong, seems to be a characteristic of in the decline of French philosophy. Former student and of Derrida and post-structuralist critic of Lacan, former student of and post-structuralist critic of Lacan is feminist philosopher, linguist, and psychoanalyst Lucy Irigaray. Expelled from Lacan's Freudian school of Paris, Irigaray correctly identifies Lacan's sexist, symbolic, and often literal concepts of castration, anxiety, and dominance of the phallus. They engage in a useful analysis of language, gender identity, difference, through a critique of what they coined as phallologocentrism. However, the taint of Lacan is also present, making some rather wild and utterly wrong statements about factual matters. For example, claiming that Einstein had accelerations without electromagnetic recalibrations, and that the mass-energy relation equals mc squared is a sexed equation, as it privileges the speed of light over other speeds that are vitally necessary to us. They also made the assertion that fluid mechanics is neglected compared to rigid mechanics because fluids are feminine. Notably, they made no contributions to fluid mechanics themselves. And if they had done so, they would discover the reason that fluid mechanics has traditionally had less influence is because it is much more difficult. But we'll make mention here that in the field of high-performance computing systems and parallel programming, that has made fluid mechanics simulations notably easier. I will also make mention here on how Julia Kristeva, despite being strongly tied to psychoanalytic and post-structuralist traditions, has managed to avoid both the more speculative scientific claims or gender essentialism. And this is probably due to their strong distinction between the symbolic and the semiotic, their anti-essentialist recognition of subjectivity and seeing subjectivity as constantly being in a process of transition, and their ongoing rejection of ontological collective identities. Anthropologist, ethnographer, and philosopher Bruno Latour provides another example of making useful and interesting insights by ending up with provocative but preposterous claims. Initially, they made excellent criticism of the hiring practices in Africa and the relationship to education. And with numerous case studies, the social construction of scientific facts, which would become foundational for science and technological studies in the 1970s onwards, would sort of fall into a situation where, rather than trying to improve scientific objectivity, Latour and others began the impossible argument that facts were made, not discovered. Likewise, in an attempt to critique the nature-culture dichotomy, and especially with regard to non-human actors, Latour went down the path of proposing a parliament of things, something more akin to the legal fiction of corporate persons, but raised to a general societal level. A scientific fact, a legal rule, and aesthetic movement are all things involved in a dynamic network. Whilst methodological individualism is clearly wrong, because we do change our behavior, clothing, so forth in the workplace, there should be no doubt, I should say, who has agency. Latour, however, brings this doubt into effect through their actor network theory. It is possible to delve even deeper, I think, into numerous examples of French philosophy that has gone awry. In many ways, it is quite easy and actually quite pleasurable to engage in an ongoing mockery of what has come out of post-structuralist and postmodernist writers in the past 5.5 decades. To trepan their heads, to open their skulls, and display to all the empty space where their brain should be. In fact, much of this has already been explored in the past as fashionable nonsense. The evocative title of the French book with the equally evocative title, Impostures Intellectuelles, from 1997 by Alan Sokal and Jean Brechmont, who highlight the sort of content that would eventually allow for the postmodern essay generator produced in, or rather precursor, allow for the postmodern essay generator produced in 1996 by Andrew Boyk of Monash University. However, as much as a historical review is important for understanding, it is necessary to go beyond a philosophical culture war of a vintage of more than 25 years. Criticism by itself does not provide an understanding of why French philosophy went into this decline, and nor does it provide doesn't address whether there's actually anything useful that can be derived from it, or whether there is a possibility of repair. And these are the sorts of things I wish to address now. Two major reasons are identified as contributing to the decline of French philosophy. The first is that failure to properly engage with the new post-colonial environment and understanding. French philosophers were, as mentioned, of course, very sympathetic and supportive of national liberation struggles from former territories. But raised in an environment where being French holds a cultural primacy, they would often fluctuate between quasi-empirical ideas or irresponsible abandonment. Now, perhaps this is excusable at the time, but after so many decades, one would expect a greater sensitivity to post-colonial philosophy, even on a principle, if only from a principle of justice. And this should be normalized by now. Secondly, there is that aforementioned theoretical and political failure of the revolutionary moment of 1968. This failure, which should have led to a sober assessment of the consciousness of the French working class and a redoubling of efforts of intellectuals to understand both phenomenologically and with authenticity what that experience entails, what that mentality includes. Instead, they went down an escapist and abandonment route. Word games, playfulness, ambivalence, obscurity, sensuality, bric-a-brac knowledge, all featuring prominently in French postmodernist writers, and as it became more of an aesthetic movement. Now, this is perfectly fine, of course, if it is clearly stated as such. After all, the validation of artistry is sincerity, because truthfulness is beautiful. This artistry can even be applied to scientific inquiries, as Michel Sarr illustrated. Spellbinding and poetic lectures of natural phenomena, and whose Contra Naturel from 1990 is an early philosophical study on a need to address climate change. If there is a clear advantage and contribution from post-structuralist and postmodernist philosophy that has lasting usefulness, it is certainly their understanding of the post-industrial setting and the appeal of cultural hedonism, sometimes celebrated, sometimes criticized. It is certainly a philosophy that has appeal in contemporary advanced capitalism. Even Baudrillard, who is one of the most determined and illustrative writings of the debasement of grounded meaning in contemporary society, comes from a nostalgic worldview where facts existed and truth claims in reference to facts was the means of verification and debate, rather than the temporary media announcements of a superficial post-truth world. The situation is not entirely grim for French philosophy. There is a real need to return to material phenomenal conditions rather than to idealism, to take into account hermeneutic interpretation and linguistic pragmatics rather than the semantic word games, to investigate political economy and moral philosophy rather than cultural criticism, to abandon out-of-date psychoanalysis and attempts to build language around the unconscious, which, it must be mentioned, there is no empirical evidence. A need to move towards investigations that are grounded in psychological reality, such as implicit biases, such as hidden motives, vested interests, and of course, aesthetic theory, which does have provable therapeutic value. One can start as a sort of bridge with Catherine Malabor, who comes from a deconstructionist and post-structuralist tradition and certainly writes in that style, or code if you like, but applies these concepts to materiality, and informed by neuroscience develops the concept of plasticity of the subject, the experience of transformation, what it means to be transformed in the brain through trauma, through biological processes. There are aforementioned French philosophers who are taking on the approaches I just mentioned. Among linguistic pragmatic philosophers, one includes the foundational works of Oscar de Croix with their investigations and argumentation and presuppositions. Francois Racanti, contributions on context dependence in language and thought and speech acts is also extremely valuable, especially in truth conditional pragmatics. Notably, Racanti started in the Lacanian community, but left, finding it devoid of meaning, and then instead began to focus on ordinary language philosophy. Henri Bol combines philosophical theory with empirical work in pragmatics, with well-developed studies in the evolution of language and reference to individual cognition and for community integration. Jacques Moschler provides formal pragmatic accounts of connective, semantic implicatures, and other critically important elaborations of formal pragmatics, and asks the blunt question, why language? Pascal Engel has engaged in pragmatic encroachment, epistemology, and the intersection of logic, semantics, and pragmatics. From the existential and phenomenological approaches, Claude Romano focuses on the transformational effects of major life events. And as a contrast, Renard Barbaras studies the phenomenological generation of meaning throughout life, life experience, through life as a whole. Jean-Luc Marion does a marvelous descriptions and understandings of saturated phenomena, our experiences and consciousness, where our senses are overwhelmed. And in a related field, Marc Ricoeur develops a phenomenology of the inapparent, the vague and chaotic fringes that exist just below the surface of clear conscious apperception. Emmanuel Fabre explores the finite limits of phenomenology and the existential experience of the embodied subject. Francois Raffol on the ethical dimension of our event of being in the world. And finally, as an engagement between critical theory from the Frankfurt School and French philosophy, Emmanuel Renaud, not to be confused with a famous chef with a similar name, provides investigations into social pathologies, the suffering caused through by social conditioning, and combines post-structuralist influences with critical theory, exploring the notion of recognition. Stefan Haber provides investigations in political emancipation, disempowerment, and alienation under capitalism, along with epistemology. And as one of those very rare individuals, Yves Courset, a professional philosopher and professional comedian, whose dress sense is certainly in the spirit of the latter, provides insightful contributions on the philosophy of rational communication, art, and, of course, as expected, humor. All of these thinkers show that French philosophy contains more than just the seeds of revival. The aforementioned speakers take a very different approach to the more well-known post-structuralist and postmodernist thinkers. And in terms of shock value, their works are usually less controversial, but they are often more provocative in a practical manner. In an environment where post-structuralism, and indeed much of postmodernism, has run its course, founded on false assumptions and accumulating an embarrassment rather than usefulness, the time is certainly right for new developments in French philosophy that include both those traditional contributions of authenticity and experientiality that we receive from the existentialists and the phenomenologists, the clear-sighted rationalism of ordinary language philosophy and pragmatics, and with emancipatory intent and informed approach to the new cultural, technical, and political environments of our time. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you, Lev, for your presentation on French philosophy. Now, before we open the meeting up to questions, comments, and discussion with Lev, I have a couple of announcements. The first of which is that the next Existentialist Society lecture will take place in 1 month's time on Saturday, the 2nd of May. And we have Professor Stephen Torbenek speaking on Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Marx, Nietzsche, and beyond. I'll repeat that. Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Marx, Nietzsche, and beyond. So that's in 1 month's time. Now, the Existentialist Society meets at this time every Saturday afternoon, and we promote various other groups on those occasions. And to get the topics and the links, the best means is to get onto the Existential Society's meetup page, whose link I've just put in the chat. So for our questions, comments and discussion session, we'll use the raised hand method. And for those who don't know, you'll find the raised hand icon in the React tab at the bottom of your screen. So, Michelle,
Wow.
go ahead.
Thank you for recognizing me on the microphone, Sir David. Sir Lev, fantastic talk, fantastic lecture. I could tell you embraced it with a lot of enthusiasm and passion. And I really felt that all come through in your lecture. A lot of it was over my head and my pay grade, because I was informally taught philosophy and not formally taught. Though I was in college and university, they weren't that great of an experiences. So yeah, and if anyone sees me smoking my cigarette through my nose, it's just Rapa. It's a way to get Rapa. So hopefully that's not too offensive.
Thank you for those kind remarks, Michelle.
Yeah.
Look, you're quite right, and part of the passion is that the post-structuralists and postmodernists are absolutely enjoyable to read. There's absolutely no doubt about that. They have grand artistry, but when it comes to the practical contributions that they can make to philosophy, to logic, to epistemology, to ontology, and for notions of justice, they are often sorely lacking. So there was a bit of there was a lot of a search of, is there contemporary philosophers from the Francophone world who provide a way out? And there is. In fact, actually, I think this is, if you like, this is what is coming after. I'm giving like a preview in a sense of what is coming after the more well-known French philosophy that brings us to the end of the 20th or the beginning of the 21st century. There are new French philosophers out there who have taken into account that scientific culture war that occurred in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and are producing material which is a lot more useful.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Remco, it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you, Lev. I have a question, but Lev, I'd like to ask you first a question, simple question, addressing the title of your talk. You say the decline in French philosophy. What is the evidence for that, Lev?
That I've been asked this question, right? Because if you were to measure the decline in terms of, I don't know, do you want to use an empirical value like citations or something like that?
Yeah.
So exactly. So when I gave the introduction, I went, okay, I gave it in terms of the definitions of decline representing a fewer or a lessened, and philosophy in terms of contributions to logic, epistemology, and ontology. And that's where I see a decline. Particularly if I compare it to the very impressive, phenomenologically informed French philosophy of science that occurred in the 20th century.
Okay, all right.
That's the measure I'll use.
All right, so it sounds almost like the contribution to brackets philosophy, or inverted commas, I mean.
Yeah.
Right? So you're seeing a relative decline in the French philosophy compared to other philosophy contributions. Is that it? I just want to nail it
Yeah,
down.
yeah, no, yeah, that's quite correct. I think that's all like, things. I mean, look, there was the big linguistic turn that basically kicked off in the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s, and I think that's things like, it basically went, the major contributions was either linguistic pragmatics, such as you would find in like second generation Frankfurt School, ordinary language philosophy from the Anglo-American perspective, and what we've seen in French philosophy. And I think the French philosophical contribution's gone a little bit awry. They did get the setting right, though. They were absolutely spot on with that.
All right. I think, I won't hog it, but I needed to get that clear at what you were actually
No,
communicating here.
it's a very good question, and a fellow scientist literally asked me this like 2 hours ago.
Right. Okay, because I'm a bit wary that what people call philosophy is,
Yep.
in my view, almost a category error. That is
Yeah.
what most people, particularly in the English-speaking world, call philosophy. I feel is more an offshoot of science. And
Yep.
I'm very much in the Wittgenstein camp, where I see philosophy is clarifying more than
Yes.
resolving problems, and so I'm a little
Mhm.
bit sensitive when something is promoted, such as a decline in French philosophy, because I would argue, well, that depends on relativities, and I'm saying that what people call analytical philosophy, and I dare say the majority here. But
Yep.
I would say, hang on. It's an institutional drift towards having tangibles. This is the
Yeah.
world of tangibles. And I think the French make a very valuable, important contribution. And I would argue, perhaps they're less visible, but are still doing it. Anyway, that's
Mm.
my defense.
Yeah, no, that's a good comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Dimitar, unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now, right?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for this, Lev. A bit preparing on the fly, so I didn't have much time. But I just to create some framework to better understand, in continuation to the previous question, like how to qualify decline compared to what. So the general questions would be, is it decline versus the Western philosophy, which I think it's in the real decline, because how many people actually, when you say people, not just from the West, does the world accept both? Actually, the framework would be, for me, philosophy is empty freedom of speech unless it applies the knowledge to improve the world. What's the point of just talking about something? And up to, like, in terms of scientific, just another clarification, philosophy is the highest cognitive achievement of humans, and science was introduced much later to stop the crappy philosophy, because people can talk everything until we try to prove. It's like just mostly, just a street talk. And also, sorry, probably too many things. Lacan, I know actually he was very popular and was in a way opening another dimension, and not being popular does not mean it's actually bad. Same as, for example, Bach was understood centuries later. It was more like a abstract and similar with Picasso, that style. So it's nothing wrong with that thing until the people are mature to understand what it means. So just I want to open this thing. Are we actually moving again back to the incomplete, immature, idealistic philosophy, which means not related to reality, just in our heads? Or are we actually moving forward to something that's really applicable to the rest of the world? And I just asked question, does China utilize any of these dialectical materialism or existentialism and all that stuff? They say their priority is they have their cultural sort of values, but also dialectical materialism is what they utilize, which means they apply on every step at its tested system. It's not somebody's idealistic in their head and never practically applied. Thank you.
No, a good question. And look, I would have to give deeper and further consideration on whether this is, and I've also noticed it popped up in the chat as well, whether it is a example of French philosophy in particular, whether it's a global phenomenon, whether there is a decline in philosophy. If we are thinking in terms of philosophy as being the use of logic, ontology, epistemology to actually further practical sort of applications in terms of science, justice, and the arts. I don't have an answer at the moment to that, but I do note that there has been, definitely, if just like delve into the studies, some very good works that have looked, things like, studies in truth conditional pragmatics, context-related pragmatics, even the entire approach of formal pragmatics itself, which was initiated by Otto Appel and Jürgen Habermas. I think that was a very big philosophical contribution, which has been followed on to help us reduce the amount of confusion that can exist in speech between people, right? But I want to take on board your comment for further consideration on whether this is something which is particular to France, which I suspect it isn't, or whether it is a global phenomenon, or whether it is particular to some societies, like have we seen a decline in, say, American philosophy? Because America had a very long-standing pragmatic tradition. Does it apply to Chinese philosophy? With the rise of China, and in particular their political class that is dominated by engineers, which is a very interesting phenomenon in its own right. But I don't have an answer at this point, but I do see the importance of the question which you offered, and I promise to investigate it.
Thank you, Lev. George, it's your turn. Oops. Unmute yourself, George.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much. Like, on this issue of the decline of even the notion of French philosophy, I mean, it's a turn against the Enlightenment, right? And so, your preview highlights the centrality of French philosophers in the project of the Enlightenment, right? In the vaunting of reason. And so I would submit to you that up until that point, there is no French philosophy. There's just simply Enlightenment philosophy. The French turn is the turn against Enlightenment, right? So here we're talking about the postmodern thinkers, the embrace of Heidegger, right? And so in general, I mean, what I would submit to you is that certainly after World War II, the analytic turn is against the Enlightenment, right? I would submit to you hostile to reason. Now, with the French philosophers, and you've highlighted 68, I submit what occurred was a demoralization from the betrayal of the Stalinist Communist Party, right? Apart from the fact that they betrayed the populace, it really brings to light the fact that the Stalinists, that Soviet Union is not interested in social justice, is not interested in revolution in any way. And again, this is demoralizing. Now, the other thing I'm going to raise to you, and you may not be aware of this, there's a really fascinating book that I'm reading now. It's called Who Pays the Pipers of Western Marxism. And what he makes the argument is that these thinkers, Foucault, Herbert Marcuse, Adorno, Horkheimer, they are promoted by the CIA. Yes. They are viewed as effective agents of anti-communism because while they make critical noise about capitalism, they're opposed to any real revolution, to any real social change. And so when we see the rise of French philosophy, this turn against the Enlightenment, right? Part of it is, like I said, I think the demoralization that occurs after 68, but also the skullduggery of the CIA in promoting these thinkers, including pushing them up to the bestseller list, mind you, right? But so, that's my thinking, that's my analysis, because, again, I look at this myself. I look at these issues myself. So thank you very much for your presentation. I really appreciated it.
I quite like what you're thinking, what you're arguing there, George, and we'll follow up on that book that you've referenced. A few years ago, I had an article published in the Polish Journal of Aesthetics, which was the editors were initially surprised by what I was saying, but the empirical evidence is overwhelming that the American School of Abstract Expressionism was quite literally a CIA plot. And it sounds incredible that they were bothered to do this, but they needed the US required an aesthetic school which took away the revolutionary edge of fine artists in America, could counter the romanticism, false, or even if completely false, the romanticism that was offered by Eastern Bloc socialist realism, and would also appeal to Western Europeans as being, yes, we can produce art as well. And so they came out, successive chairs and leaders of Museum of Modern Art in New York were directly funded through this American intelligence agencies, and it seems incredible, but the documentation proving this is overwhelming, including their own admission, and the artistic component of abstract expressionism meant that any sort of critical component was taken away from the art. The radical artist was just a subjective artist in their experience. They were rebels without a cause. So what you're saying politically about philosophers, I know has got at least a kernel of truth. I mean, Herbert Marcuse's what's it called, One-Dimensional Man. Opens up by recognizing the contributions of the Rockefeller Foundation in getting the book published. And to be fair, the Americans were promoting the Frankfurt School and gave them a home, but in American universities because they were anti-fascist. Now, the interesting thing with your claim, which I want to look further into, is whether that anti-fascist became an anti-revolutionary thing, even though they were quite obviously promoting radical ideas. And I'm interested in because they were cultural critics. Adorno and Horkheimer's comments on the culture industry are quite devastating. And they do put it in a position of political economy as well as the cultural effects. But I'll follow up on what you said. Sounds really interesting.
Well, let me say that. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's a few things to unpack here. First and foremost, Adorno, etc., were valued not for their anti-fascism, but for their anti-communism. Indeed, they were lavishly financed by the CIA, by wealthy donors, including by the Rockefellers. You had these people working for the Rain Corporation, for instance. They were quite overtly and unambiguously tools of American empire. Now, again, their utility was their reputations as radicals, right? But here they're paper tigers, right? Yes, let's critique culture, but let's not talk about any kind of profound change, right? And so they were always, again, Adorno was very clear. Like, I'm not into any kind of practice. I'm opposed to change. Foucault was a virulent anti-Soviet, anti-communist, actually. So, I mean, the point about the expressions, I mean, there's a book, I don't have it, I can once I'm traveling right now, but let me see if I get back to my room and I can look up the book that actually looks at the role of the CIA behind abstract expressionism. I believe that actually there was a director of MoMA. One of the directors was actually a CIA operative. So, I mean, the CIA
more than one.
infiltrated these institutions. I think actually the head of CBS.
Successive directors.
Yeah, I think the head of CBS, as a matter of fact, at one point was a CIA operative. So, I mean, the CIA made a point of penetrating academic institutions. I mean, one point I'll make very quickly, because, you know, I do have an axe to grind against analytic philosophers. I mean, the reality is that the McCarthyism was very focused on philosophy. Philosophy really suffered under the blacklist. And the result was the death of continental philosophy in the US. And again, the promotion of analytical philosophy, again, as anti-Enlightenment reasoning. Now, not expressly anti-Enlightenment, but certainly the rejection and jettisoning of justice as a subject of study, right? And so,
George, if you get the opportunity, look at my essay in the Polish Journal of Aesthetics entitled "Abstract Expressionism as Anti-Aesthetics." I think you'll like it.
Could you post it? Could you post the title or the link or something on chat?
Yep, I will.
I may ask for it again because I'm traveling right now. I'm not in my room right now, but okay, thank you. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you, George. James, it's your turn.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Lev. I came in a little bit late, but could you give some examples of philosophers of the French who are in decline, like Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze? Are those? Would you say that those are representative of this kind of decline in philosophy as compared to maybe like Heidegger, who is becoming more popular and more taken seriously, in spite of his affiliations with Nazism?
Sorry, could you run that by me again?
What's that?
Could you run that again? That second part?
Oh yeah, like are you talking about French philosophers? French philosophy as in decline, is that represented by philosophers like Foucault, Deleuze, and Derrida? Are those good examples compared to someone like Heidegger, who is making a resurgence? I'm
not sure whether we'd say Heidegger was French.
No, I'm saying compared to a German philosopher like Heidegger, who is taken more more as a positive movement in philosophy.
I'm not sure about whether Heidegger would fall into that category. I mean, he made some interesting contributions on the philosophy concerning technology, and of course, I don't know. I mean, a number of those philosophers were very influenced by Heidegger. Coming from that phenomenological tradition. But yeah, I'm not sure whether the comparing the two is something that is something within the scope of this presentation. I'm not too sure where to take that.
Right. Because when you're talking about French philosophers, French philosophy as a kind of a decline, are you saying that they're not offering something positive, like
very much. They often contain some very useful things. I mean, Foucault's criticism of the institutional power, discipline and punishment and so forth. The way that he talked about the mental health institutions. These are very, very laudable contributions.
Sure.
And there was some his early works where he talks about the responsibility of intellectuals, to actually speak truth to power is extremely useful. And you're absolutely correct. But over time, he just, it's even become a bit of an internet joke meme, yes, young Michelle, you do have to go to school, but mum, school's a prison, he ended up really conflating and being unable to differentiate between truth, power, and knowledge, because he saw power structures everywhere. So they all became as relatively important. So, having a look at the sort of like, the as George was talking about, the anti-enlightenment and anti-rational approaches. Yes, there is value in sort of like investigating sort of like what are the hidden motives, the less sort of like clear and justifiable hidden motives that are behind institutions or behaviors. Mental health institutions are supposed to have a curative effect, but they often included sort of like, some terrible vices as well. This is a useful thing to do, but for the purposes of improving these things. So, when you get Latour talking about, rather than pointing out, yes, there's like, some terrible biases in the generation of scientific facts, rather than saying, hey, let's like improve the processes. They take a strong social constructionist like perspective and say, oh well, it's all truth and knowledge is actually entirely constructed, socially constructed with malevolent intent, and we're not going to. I mean, that's wrong, because we do actually see a notion of progress. We do actually have situations where people engage in scientific criticism and peer review in order to improve science. So I think that's like, rather than like dwell in the darkness and obscurity all the time and assume that the entire world is constantly out to get us, there needs to be a clarity and a path that, based on phenomenological experience and existential authenticity. I mean, that is a great contribution that the phenomenologists and existentialists made. Anyway, that's my 2 cents on that.
Right. So you're saying that if they're not, hearing to this existentialist phenomenological experience, you would describe them as sort of in decline and not less practical, right?
I think they look, they came into decline, and as we've discussed today, in that post 1968 period. Okay. But I do think there is opportunities for, so I listed like, gave a bit of a whirlwind list of like 20 or so practicing French philosophers today. There is the possibility of revival. And taking up those traditions again, with the new insights from pragmatics and from ordinary language philosophy.
So someone like
and also post-colonial thinkers as well. One of the interesting things that's like, came out from the 1950s and 60s onwards was a realization and acceptance that decolonization itself was not going to be possible, because the genie was already out of the bottle. You couldn't revert to a pre-colonial state. So initial sort of moves towards decolonization became more post-colonial, which still obviously meant let's accept national liberation. Let's like actually start using our language rather than the language of the colonizer. Let's revive our own cultures. And some more successful than others. For example, you don't actually find French spoken too widely, say, in Vietnam. Maybe if you go to the very far north, etc. It will vary on different countries.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Stephen, your turn.
Thanks a lot, Lev, for the sermon. That was brilliant. Loved it. I was wondering, looking at the history of, Western Europe, you might say the revival begins with the Franks, really. I think it's very much overlooked that the Franks virtually recreated civilization in Western Europe, leaving aside Italy, and civilized the Anglo-Saxon barbarians and the Viking barbarians and the other German barbarians with a little bit of violence that couldn't be helped. I think people they just overlooked it, where the modern West, the post-Roman West, was a product of the Frankish Empire, and people just don't seem to get on to that one. And of course, the French embraced the new mechanistics thinking, which arose in the 18th century to a much greater degree than other people. Of course, you go to France and they'd become sort of modern, you know. They used to employ German soldiers because rationalists made very poor soldiers, it seems. They didn't want to get killed in battles. But the Germans were tough guys, and Germans came there. They kept on, and every time the French would try to convince them of rationalism, the giant German soldiers would say, "By God." And that became the basis of our word bigot. But I was wondering what you think of the French philosopher Raymond Aron's a very interesting case. He seems to be rather overlooked. I first got on to watching Kubrick's movie Oh Lucky Man and seeing scrawled on a building, "Revolution is the opium of the intellectual." And of course that was his case, that, you know, the modern intellectual, particularly the French ones, were engaging in a type of ecstatic religion. Yeah, he was asking for them all to calm down. He did start out as a Marxist, but eventually, in opposition to the rest of the French, became conservative. So I was wondering what you could say about Raymond Aron.
Yeah, look, no, that's actually a really good contribution. He, you know, I mean, he was, you know, very, very insightful, and, you know, encapsulated, you know, the approach is encapsulated in that famous 1955 book, The Opium of the Intellectuals, which they probably, you know, obviously it's like a lot of the philosophers did not take to very kindly. I think that's like, you know, one of his important legacies, of course, is the work of sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, who was one of his students. I think that, you know, his commitment to political liberalism cannot be so, like, you know, is beyond any doubt. But, you know, I don't really see him providing a huge contribution outside his rational humanism, which contributes to philosophy, strictly speaking. He did contribute, I guess, to, so, like, you know, to studies in history. He did contribute a lot on social commentary, more of a historian and sociologist, and rather than, so, like, somebody who I felt I could mention in terms of their contributions to philosophy, particularly in this context. And I think that's maybe why he has been overlooked. Like, if I was to, like, think, you know, what is the big philosophical contribution of Raymond Aron?
Except for that one outstanding line.
Exactly. Which is a sociological line. You know, and he's not wrong. Right. I would, if somebody like him, I think, you could probably put in the same category as, say, Karl Popper. But of course, Karl Popper made contributions to epistemology.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, good question.
Jenna, go ahead.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Lev, for the presentation. I think you answered some of the questions that I initially thought during your conversation with other speakers. So I think I'm just gonna pick on what George was mentioning earlier. I'm curious. So do you think that the shift you describe in the thinkers like Foucault was mainly because their ideas just went too far internally, or more because of the external pressure like the political influences that George mentioned earlier. So I guess like that's more, I'm gonna stop.
Yeah, look, I think the political influences were more important initially, and in order to sort of like I mean, the thinking was going to occur, right? I mean, we are talking about thinkers here, which are at least most of the cases of people who I've mentioned did actually engage in a serious and self-reflective approach. But the influences, I think, had priority, initial priority.
Oh,
and certainly, actually, one of the criticisms that you get from Sokal and Brechmont was that in order to retain relevance, academic relevance, there was a need to be provocative, and sometimes the best way to be provocative is to say preposterous things from a position of authority. Australian politics standing out at the moment.
Thank you, Jenna. Philip, it's your turn. Philip.
Here. Okay. It's me now, okay?
Yes.
Give me a right. It's such an erudite presentation, so many personalities of philosophers. But I'm a particular interest with Paul Ricoeur because in the 85 to 90s, he was very popular among seminarians and Protestant philosophers. Could you explain why?
No, I can't actually. That is an excellent. That is an interesting and enticing case. What happened? What happened to Ricoeur?
He's not so popular here.
Yeah, no, that's right.
I read some.
I mean, hang on. He probably had stopped writing by that point, and he did provide contributions to the philosophy of language as well. I honestly don't know. I don't know why he fell out of favor.
Just another question, just a short one.
Yeah.
Like Gabriel Marcel, his writing is so unorganized.
Gabriel, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Okay. Gabriel Marcel.
Yeah, Gabriel Marcel. Yeah.
You find his writings disorganized?
So,
I have a hard time with him.
Yeah, probably something. I mean, I have erred in probably overlooking mentioning Marcel's contribution, and that's certainly on that description of where I discussed the various contributions by phenomenologists and existentialists. Oh, mind you, I overlooked Levinas as well. So yes, you're right that he certainly deserves being added into that list. Interestingly, though, of course, that one could give a presentation on his rather pessimistic ideas of the role of a technological society. But yeah, certainly in that context, it would be interesting to do a comparison between him and the greater enthusiasm that you find in sort of like amongst the post-structuralist and postmodernist philosophers, who really do and quite accurately do put the post-industrial technologies as the centerpiece of their setting. And I think that's actually something which is very appropriate of them to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you. Thank you for sort of like reminding me of Marcel, who I did neglect to include in that initial site description.
Thank you, Philip. Ariel, your turn.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I enjoyed it. It caused me to do a little bit of research and questioning, which is good. That's always good. So I have a few things, I guess, that I'm questioning here. So you're saying specifically French. French.
Francophone.
Huh? I'm sorry.
Francophone, right? I don't want to limit it to the borders of France. I don't want to limit it to people of French birth, or but I want to be more an inclusive definition of French.
Okay. So I guess first, what I would say is you're saying post-structuralism is probably replacing, I guess, the popularity of existentialism. So, but that's French too. So, yes. So it gets a little confusing in terms of popularity and decline, because that, I mean, existentialism you could say has declined, specifically with academia, but definitely general population overall still recognizes the existentialism because of its individualistic tendencies. It's emphatic.
Existentialism did not do well with the transition from philosophy of consciousness to philosophy of language. How do we know that other people exist in existentialism as conscious actors? I mean, the best that sort of like, Sartre could come up with is this like thing called the look. I mean, it hardly stands up to the ability to form shared symbolic values with others, like, of other conscious beings, right? With mutual understanding. So yeah, you're quite right that existentialism, in terms of like being a world philosophy of great significance, has also gone into decline. Existentialism needs to be updated because it has got things that are important, important and necessary in today's world. A dash of authenticity would not go wrong in today's society. Certainly we could do with it amongst some of our politicians. So I actually do correlate this decline in French philosophy with a decline in French existentialism as well. I think that that would be something worth noting. I did list some phenomenologists who are doing, I think, some valuable contemporary work, and hopefully we can see something come out of that.
Okay, I just think that, I guess I just wanted to get an idea of where you're saying in terms of today, in terms of what, like in academia, in publishing, in writing, there's a decline in French. But
no, I'm not.
Are you just saying overall?
Because I've specifically said I'm not measuring this in terms of popularity or citations or anything like that. I'm measuring it in terms of contributions to philosophy, which I have defined as logic, epistemology, and ontology. This was like in the second, right at the start of the presentation. I said, if I'm going to talk about a decline in French philosophy, I'm going to have to define what I mean by French decline and philosophy.
Okay, so you're being very specific. So I must have missed that. I missed that in the beginning. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
So that kind of clarifies things. Yeah, I was kind of perplexed because in terms of like cultural media and things like that,
Enormously important.
Existentialism is very, very much out there everywhere, especially during COVID. I think everybody was, thinking about the existentialist moment. So yeah, and I just didn't understand the you got into the post-structuralism, which I realize has replaced structuralism, and I was trying to say, well, that's
kind of.
So, yeah.
It was I don't know. I mean, there probably is argument that what we call post-structuralism is really just a continuation of structuralism.
Yeah.
Right.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I enjoyed it. Got me thinking, which is important. Right. It's good to think. Thank you.
It sure is. Thank you for your questions.
George, go ahead.
Yes. So I've gone ahead and posted some works that you may or may not be familiar with. I put the one up there about the CIA financing of these French postmodernists, including also the Frankfurt School, which is very closely associated, in many ways.
Yeah.
There's also a very good book, a very excellent book, called the Seduction of Unreason, in which what the author does. You familiar with that book?
Yep, I'm looking at it. Yeah. That sounds
that book
right.
Basically
that sounds about right to me.
Yeah. How French philosophy, certainly in the post-war period, embraces the anti-Enlightenment of Nietzschean Germans.
Yep.
Right. Now, the real difference, and he does textual analysis. Now, the real difference is that well, not the real difference, but a key difference in my mind, at least, is that the German anti-Enlightenment people are much more pointed and lucid in their argumentation, whereas the French, they try to embrace the ideas, but they try to be more opaque about it. Right.
Yeah.
But, and someone did an analysis. This is in the American Political Science Review. They looked at Foucault's writing, and they were able to show that it mirrored Nietzschean writing almost to the point of plagiarism.
Yeah.
And so,
well, of course, they were very you would find, I mean, even from particularly Foucault, was quite open about being influenced by Nietzsche.
Right. And so, but again, it's an explicit anti-Enlightenment turn. The other again phenomenon and parallel that I find very interesting and very related, like I've already noted this, is the analytical turn in American philosophy. And so there's Time in the Ditch. It's about how the state intervened to ensure that analytic philosophy would win out in the American context and repressing continental philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
There's also the book there. That's a very good book, Time in the Ditch. Yeah, and there's a new book too, also, A Social History of Analytic Philosophy. So again, to me, these are both, we talk about analytic philosophy and French philosophy, postmodernism, etc. I mean, to me, these are both anti-Enlightenment turns in different forms, right? Yep. For the analytic philosopher, it's the worship of science. But the rejection of justice, the rejection of politics, right? Yeah. So it's trying to hitch its wagon to the prestige of science, and in doing so, trying to expressly jettison justice and expressly jettison politics, right? And so, all this to me is very interconnected. Now, again, A Social History of Analytic Philosophy, which is a very new book, is also very, very interesting. Now, that's analytic philosophy, but again, I really think you could be in a position to draw some of the comparisons between analytic philosophy and the French turn towards postmodernism in terms of embracing anti-rationality. Thank you.
Thank you, George. I've got all those links now. Brilliant.
Fantastic.
Much
Thank you, brother. My pleasure.
James, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you again. So would you say something about Derrida or maybe Deleuze in terms of how they're not contributing that much to philosophy?
Well, look, I think
Yeah.
I think in both cases, the shadow or taint of Lacan's like looms large over both of them. Derrida actually does. I do find deconstruction is actually a fairly useful method, and I actually do think that it derives and elaborates on dialectical reasoning. And does so in quite a clever way. And I think Deleuze's contribution on identity and difference started off, as an excellent approach. I am perplexed that he decided to try to invert what was like, try to invert what was where he the relationship, when he was obviously making, rather than seek a I guess a synthesis that allowed for a recognition that identity and difference are both requisite and dependent on each other. So yeah, that's probably my main take on those two thinkers. Derrida's sort of like Derrida's commentary can often be a bit frustrating. As Searle famously takes to task his comments, there is no outside text, and then when you actually get down to the nitty gritty details, Derrida's saying there is nothing outside, there is no text outside of context, and you go, well, that's quite obvious, but where are you going to follow that from? And Searle was quite frustrated by Derrida in that regard, by starting off with provocative statements and ending up with statements that were, quite obvious and obviously needed more work. Sometimes I found that quite interesting when he was writing in on grammatology. One of the lines that sticks out there is that writing precedes speaking. Now, this sounds counterintuitive, except for perhaps when you think of it in a neurological sense, that you'd actually do the encoding in your brain, which is sort of like writing to it, before you actually you have to understand a word before you're actually speaking it in a sensible manner, rather than just using a word incorrectly. But anyway, that's I don't know whether I can talk much more about those two in this particular context now, without a particular question relating to their works, and in which case I'll possibly have to do some further investigation.
Oh, well, back at me.
Yeah, it must be you.
Yeah. I thought, one of this question of existentialism, it's I get the feeling that it's something there wasn't enough credit, really given to Schelling. Because Schelling in his 1840 lectures, in a sense, rejected the grand project. He felt that it's not that he said that there wasn't some value in vast rationalist systems, but what he said in the 1840s lectures was it would be always chasing the bus of existence. No matter how beautiful you made, tremendous rational, it's always going to be missing something there. The thing that annoys me is about Sartre. You get the feeling he doesn't really credit where he got his ideas from a bit, I think. Do you ever get that feeling yourself?
Yeah, I think there is something about that. Yeah, and I think it is important to sort of like to at least sort of like mention where you're getting your works from and who's like the notable contributors to your own thinking. None of us think so like from a pure vacuum.
I thought that, in that outstanding movie was, Peter Fonda's Easy Riders, took up that existential principle. Of course, he was critical of the irresponsibility of his protagonists.
Mm.
That, had that beautiful example, Jack Nicholson, they get hit by the rednecks and Jack Nicholson gets killed.
Yeah.
And a normal social responsibility. Oh, we have to report this to the police. Man, I can't handle that. Let's just bury him and go to a whorehouse. I mean, I think
and all the disasters that
central critique of the hippie.
Actually, was like situations like that. I think one of the most marvelous is Emile Zola's novel The Beast in Man, which starts off with like a relationship dalliance and an attempt to cover it up, which gets more and more complicated, requiring further cover-ups and additional disasters occurring, culminating with a driverless train about to plummet through an entire village. Right? It just there's this chain of sort of behaviors like where a fairly minor, a relatively minor cover-up leads to a like much larger disaster as people sort of like try to sort of like hide what they have done.
Well, certainly the tremendous existential trend in film.
Yeah.
I think probably my favourite was The Time Bandits, I suppose.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, well, actually, that's a very good example. Do like that film.
But horribly, of course, now they make nothing but superhero films in Hollywood and films without any existential prospect whatsoever. Thank you very much.
Well, the interesting thing about the Time Bandits is that it's like that party of individuals had such important responsibilities and were actually quite incompetent in carrying them out. And the idea that you're basically led by fools.
Well, yes, God, what were these? He was sort of suffering from some sort of mental incompetent problem, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's right.
The evil one was smart.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michelle, it's your turn. Go ahead, Michelle.
David, for unmuting me and giving me the opportunity to speak on the microphone. Yet again, Lev, I appreciate your passion for French, and I'm sure you have a passion for French culture, yes, and the language.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I've been there several times.
I appreciate it, yeah. I want to say something to you in French, but you'll have to excuse me.
Malgré ce nom long.
You'll have to excuse me if I take French language to an abattoir for a moment.
It's okay.
But parlez-vous en français? That's like how you speak. Like, do you speak sweet French?
Oui, je parle un peu français. Pas bien.
Très magnifique. Très magnifique. Et très magnifique et révolutionnaire. Révolutionnaire en France philosophière.
Merci.
What do you think? Is that right? There should be a revolution back to French philosophy.
Yes. And I mean, look, it doesn't actually, I mean, there should be a return to some of those. I've mentioned this a couple of times. A return to some of those excellent contributions, I think, which the French existentialist school provided under those difficult times. There can certainly be the making use of the continuing tradition that we find in the from phenomenology. If we want to go further back, there is a good idea for grounding in 19th century, the contributions of positivism in the 19th century, particularly from the French there. And as always, that strong like secularism, even by religious people, that strong secularism that came out of the Enlightenment. Right. It's one of the continuing things that George has been talking about is the abandonment of Enlightenment principles, which does include skepticism, does include doubt, does include even sort of like, recognition of unspoken ulterior motives, that you would find. So like a big part of the German Romantic period, which would follow, but nevertheless dedicated in spirit to the rationalization and clarity and honesty. Can you imagine, it's like, a philosophical leadership that took that up as their mantle and as their principles? We're going to philosophy in a way that is clear and practical and is dedicated to scientific truth, to social justice, and to create aesthetic beauty.
I took a course in philosophy, and it was the philosophy of leadership, and that was an interesting course.
It is. Leadership studies is very interesting. We used to have an attendee to the Existentialist Society many years ago. David will probably remember him, because he would get up at every meeting and sort of like make this profound announcement that really everybody wants to be the leader. Everybody wants to rule the world. He had this like quasi-Nietzschean like approach, and the studies don't show that. Most people like think, oh no, leadership I don't want to be a leader. I want to actually have a competent person acting with that responsibility. They want somebody who's competent and with responsibility. And leaders, the worst sort of leader is the one that basically tries to impose their doctrine, overlooking the fact that leaders need followers and need to be sensitive to the wishes of their followers. So, Lao Tzu is like, talks about, the best sort of leader is the one that's almost invisible, and can walk alongside the people. And when they have made their achievements, they can say, look at everything that we have done. And they can just like smile and go, yeah, I know. And I was there helping you along all the way, but I don't need to actually take up that heroic position. So yeah, that's the sort of philosophy that would be great today. That'd be lovely to see. So thank you. David, I must also point out that I do have to return to the other function that I'm attending today. So,
right.
So if we could wrap up soon, that would be appreciated. And I'll also request a copy of the recording or a link to the recording, if you could arrange that.
Yes, the video recording will be available within a couple of days.
Fantastic.
On our YouTube channel, but I'll send you the link anyway.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Good. Well, thank you, Lev, for your presentation on French philosophy and its decline.
I thoroughly enjoyed giving it.